Well, hi there. So in this video, we got a big old list of prompts. And what we're going to do is use the same prompts from the last topic, but now do they affect aggregate demand or aggregate supply? And then how do they affect output and price levels? So let's get started. Okay, so for each of these, our first thing is going to be whether AD or AS is going up or not. We're down. And then how is output and inflation affected, right? And remember, this is just Y and this is just PL. And if it really, if you get stuck, right, you can have a little picture right here and have SRAS here and aggregate demand here, right? And if aggregate demand goes up, you can kind of imagine what would happen to prices and output and things like that. So it can be helpful to have that little picture off to the side. Number one, significant boom in the stock market makes the consumers feel rich. That's going to affect consumer spending, and it's going to make that go up. So we would say aggregate demand goes up. Output, therefore, would rise and price levels would rise, right? Because you'd have a higher AD. Higher inflation is widely expected soon. Inflationary expectations are an aggregate supply shifter, and they're going to decrease aggregate supply because of resource costs. That's going to make output go down, but it's going to make prices go up. Number three, Americans express preferences for new foreign cars. That's going to make XN go down, which means aggregate demand is going to go down. That's because we're importing these cars, right? Imports count against us. So imports down, so that would mean output falls and inflation falls. More workers obtain higher education, improving productivity. This productivity is the key here. Aggregate supply is going to increase, output's going to rise, and prices will fall. Again, if you're having trouble envisioning how would that happen, right? You could draw a little section here and say, well, when SRAS rises, right, shifts to the right, that's going to cause prices to go down and output to go up. For number five, businesses report larger inventories at the end of the year. Inventories is part of investment spending. That's aggregate demand. So there's more aggregate demand, more output, and higher prices. If there's foreign trade countries that have more income and economic expansion, they're going to buy more of our products. So our XN will go up. So our aggregate demand will rise, our output will rise, and our prices would rise. Businesses develop technology that improves labor productivity. Again, productivity is an aggregate supply shifter. It's an increase. So we're going to have more output and lower prices. Congress cuts personal income taxes. Well, this is going to affect, obviously, consumption spending, and it's going to boost consumption spending, making output go up along with prices. For some folks that get confused here, they think Congress cuts income taxes means that doesn't mean, though they think that it means this, but it doesn't. It doesn't mean government spending is going to go down, right? That's what it's key to know that. A lot of students think, well, they're just cutting their income taxes, so that means that spending has to go down, right? No. The government can often spend money that it doesn't have, believe you me. So that's why this hint, not its spending, right? It doesn't mean G. Congress votes to expand immigration, and that means there's more labor supply. That's going to reduce resource costs for labor, and it's going to increase our aggregate supply. So that's going to make output rise and prices fall. The central bank cuts real interest rates. That's going to affect consumption and investment spending, and it's going to make them go up. So aggregate demand would rise, output rises, and prices rise. Consumers expect a strong job market soon. That's going to make them really confident about the economy. They're going to go out and buy things. And so aggregate demand would rise along with output and prices. Grain and oil prices rise due to the war in Ukraine. That's going to cause resource costs to rise. Resource costs are an aggregate supply shifter. If they're higher costs, it's going to be less, and that reduces output and drives up prices. For job training programs, these increasing productivity, again, aggregate supply. If we have more productivity, we have more supply. That leads more output and lower prices. Government decreases pension checks. Again, not its spending, right? So again, we have not G, right? It's not a change in G. This is a change in C. And if we're cutting pension payments, we're actually reducing consumption spending, which is going to reduce aggregate demand. So aggregate demand goes down, output goes down, and prices would fall. Businesses reduce purchases of new equipment. That's part of investment spending. So we'd say aggregate demand would fall, output would fall, and prices would fall. New worker trainings raise productivity. Again, there's that productivity piece. Aggregate supply goes up, output rises, and prices fall. Lower inflation. If this is the initial event, lower inflation, price levels don't shift the curve. So we're going to say no change, no change, no change. That one's a trick question. The lower inflation is just built into the model as part of price levels, right? So if inflation changes, it's not causing any shifts. We're just moving to a different point on the lines. Oil prices increase due to the war in the Middle East. So the higher resource costs here are going to affect aggregate supply, and that's going to drag down aggregate supply, reducing output and pushing up prices. Congress cuts defense spending. This one is G, and it's going to be a lower aggregate demand, lower output, and lower prices. So that one's a direct effect. Likewise, investment spending decreases is going to cause aggregate demand, output, and price levels to fall. It's just a direct component. US dollar decreases in price compared to the euro, making US goods cheaper for foreign buyers. So that's going to make our XN go up, which means our aggregate demand will rise, output will rise, and our price levels will rise. Foreign trade partner goes into recession. It's the exact opposite. XN falls now because they're not buying as much of our stuff. Aggregate demand goes down, output falls, and price levels fall. Higher domestic price levels. Again, bolded and underlined for a reason here. Price levels don't shift the curve. No change, doesn't affect it. Price levels are built into the model, so they aren't going to actually cause shifts of aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Fracking drives down energy costs. This is a resource cost, so it's going to increase our aggregate supply, right? Lower resource costs. So I'm going to write that here because it can be a little tricky. Lower resource costs. And that's usually the one that trips people because the lower cost is making aggregate supply go up. With more aggregate supply, you have more output and lower prices. Consumers fear a recession is coming, so their confidence is down. That means their spending is going to be down. Aggregate supply decreases, output falls, and prices fall. Rising price levels. Again, no change because prices don't shift the curve. Price levels don't shift the curve. Unions decline. You think labor costs. So this is wages, right? Wages are going down. And so it's reducing our resource costs. So aggregate supply would increase, causing output and price levels to fall. Home buyers prefer new construction housing. That's I, and that's aggregate demand. So we'd see more aggregate demand, more output, and higher price levels. Increase in Social Security payments to households. That's going to be C. That's more aggregate demand, higher output, and higher price levels. And last but not least, government cuts environmental regulations. These would be the cost of production. The cost of production. And again, in that word, production, we should know aggregate supply is affected. And if we're cutting these, that means it's reducing it. So it's going to actually increase our supply, increasing our output and lowering prices. So again, the tricky part here maybe is that when aggregate demand is changing, output and inflation are moving the same way. When aggregate supply is changing, they're going to be opposite of each other, right? They're just going to be opposite. And again, that has to do with how we've drawn supply and demand. Hopefully this helped you with going through all 30 of these prompts and thinking about output and price levels as the final thing that we're thinking about when we're affected by a prompt. I'll see you next time.